Have you ever watched your partner of decades performing some mundane task and suddenly felt a wave of pure revulsion wash over you? That moment when years of unspoken resentments crystallize into a single, undeniable truth. You may have fallen out of love with the person who shares your home. Many women in their 50s and beyond experience this shocking revelation, often dismissing it as irrational or ungrateful. But what if these feelings are actually trying to tell you something profound about the psychological patterns that have shaped your relationship? The journey from loving partnership to silent contempt rarely happens overnight, instead developing through nearly invisible dynamics that accumulate like grains of sand until they form an immovable dune between two people. Decades of emotional labor that goes unnoticed, the gradual erasure of personal identity, and the slow realization that you've outgrown your partner can transform what once felt like love into something that more closely resembles resentment or even hatred. Recognizing these patterns isn't about assigning blame, but about understanding the psychological mechanisms that have brought you to this crossroads in your relationship. For many women in their later years, acknowledging these feelings comes with overwhelming guilt and shame, as if admitting to marital unhappiness somehow negates the life you've built together or the family you've raised. Yet this awakening, painful as it might be, often represents the first step toward reclaiming the selfhood that may have been gradually surrendered over years of putting others' needs before your own. What appears as contempt for a partner might actually be the justified rebellion of a spirit that has been too long confined by outdated relationship dynamics that no longer serve your growth or happiness. The question facing many women isn't simply whether to stay or leave, but how to honestly confront these accumulated resentments without losing themselves further in bitterness or regret. There exists a middle path between silent suffering and complete dissolution, one that begins with naming and understanding the psychological patterns that have brought you to this point of emotional disconnection. By recognizing how these dynamics have shaped your relationship, you can make conscious choices about your future rather than remaining trapped in unconscious patterns established decades ago. Today, we'll explore 5 disturbing psychological patterns that explain why many aging women develop profound contempt for their long-term partners. And more importantly, how understanding these patterns can help you reclaim your sense of self, whether within your current relationship or beyond it. These insights aren't just theoretical concepts, but lived experiences that might help you make sense of your own complicated feelings and guide you toward choices that honor both your history and your future self. If you find yourself nodding along as we explore these relationship dynamics, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more wisdom on navigating life's later chapters. To illustrate these patterns, let me share a story that captures the essence of this awakening. In a well-appointed sunroom filled with afternoon light, 5 women gather for what they still call their weekly book club, though the actual discussion of literature has become increasingly secondary to the deeper conversations that unfold. Among them, Grace Wilson, the host, moves with practiced efficiency as she arranges refreshments on a side table, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in an elegant twist that complements her composed demeanor. The pleasant atmosphere shifts subtly when Richard, Grace's husband of 32 years, briefly enters the sunroom. "I'll be in my study if you need anything," he announces, without waiting for a response, already turning to leave. Only the most observant would notice how Grace's movements become marginally more rigid, how her expression hardens almost imperceptibly as she watches him go. But Diane Carter notices, perhaps because she's been paying closer attention to these subtle signals since her own separation 3 months ago. "Thank you for hosting again, Grace," says Lizzie Reynolds, settling into her usual armchair by the window. At 55, she's the youngest of the regular attendees, her face still reflecting the optimism of someone who believes her 27-year marriage can be salvaged with enough effort and understanding. The doctor says Tom's blood pressure is finally responding to the medication, and I've been making those heart-healthy recipes we talked about last month. Sharon Beck nods approvingly as she takes her seat, the sunlight catching the expensive highlights in her perfectly maintained blonde bob. Martin and I just got back from our anniversary cruise, she mentions, her voice carrying the practiced lightness of someone who has become expert at projecting marital contentment. He surprised me with a renewal of vows ceremony on the deck at sunset. He can be so thoughtful when he puts his mind to it. The newest addition to their group, Natalie Foster, listens attentively to these exchanges, her youthful 51 years making her feel somewhat like an apprentice in this gathering of women who've navigated decades of marriage. She smiles politely at Sharon's account of romantic gestures, but her eyes reveal a growing awareness that something doesn't quite match between these women's words and the undercurrents she senses beneath their carefully maintained facades. There's a moment of comfortable silence as Grace pours tea into delicate cups, the ritual familiar and soothing. Then Diane, who has been uncharacteristically quiet, sets down her untouched cup with a decisive clink against the saucer. "I have a question," she says, her voice steady despite the weight of what she's about to ask. "When did you first realize you might hate your husband?" The question hangs in the air, startling in its boldness. Sharon nearly spills her tea, recovering with a nervous laugh. "Diane, you can't just ask something like that," she says, though her protest lacks conviction. "Why not? We're all thinking it, aren't we?" Diane responds, her gaze steady as it moves. "Around the circle. 3 months ago, I was watching Dennis eating his cereal, the same way he's eaten it for 37 years, making that little slurping noise, and suddenly I felt this wave of pure revulsion. Not annoyance, not irritation, revulsion. And in that moment, I knew our marriage was over." Grace sits perfectly still, her cup suspended halfway to her lips. "That's quite an extreme reaction to cereal," she says carefully, but there's something in her expression that suggests recognition. "It wasn't about the cereal," Diane continues. "The cereal was just the moment when I couldn't pretend anymore, when I realized that what I was feeling wasn't a phase or a mood. It was the culmination of decades of something I couldn't even name until recently." Lizzie shifts uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't think hate is the right word. Marriage has ups and downs, we all know that." "Call it what you want," Diane says with a shrug. "Contempt, resentment, indifference, but let's be honest with each other at least. We've all felt it, haven't we?" The silence that follows is answer enough. Each woman seems lost in private thought, perhaps cataloguing moments when similar feelings had surfaced, quickly suppressed beneath the weight of obligation and habit. "I've been doing a lot of reading since I moved out," Diane continues, filling the silence, "trying to understand how I went from loving Dennis to whatever this is. And I've identified patterns, psychological dynamics that built up over decades until they became unbearable. I thought maybe sharing them might help us all make sense of things." Sharon glances nervously toward the door, as if worried Richard might overhear. "I suppose there's no harm in discussing theoretical relationship patterns," she says with forced lightness. "The first one hit me like a truck when I read about it," Diane says, leaning forward. "They call it the invisible workload archive. It's this mental catalogue women unconsciously maintain of all the unacknowledged labor we perform in a relationship." Sharon's polished exterior cracks slightly, like planning every birthday, every anniversary, every holiday for 35 years, while he acts surprised when the calendar reminds him the day before. "Exactly," Diane nods. "It's not just the physical tasks. It's the mental and emotional management that goes completely unseen. And while we're younger, we can suppress our awareness of this imbalance. We're busy with children, careers, aging parents. But as we get older, the clarity becomes unbearable, Sharon whispers, almost to herself. Her perfectly manicured hands tremble slightly as she sets down her cup. Last Christmas, Martin took credit for the gift we gave his sister, the one I spent weeks finding. After remembering a casual comment she'd made 6 months earlier, he genuinely believed he'd thought of it. Grace nods slowly. I have a list, I suppose, in my head. Every time Richard has interrupted me in conversation, every time he's explained something to me that I already knew, sometimes something I had just told him moments before. Every time he's taken credit for my ideas at dinner parties. And it's not just singular events, Diane explains. It's the cumulative weight of thousands of these moments, stretching back decades. Research shows that women carry approximately 75% of the mental load in heterosexual relationships, regardless of whether they work outside the home. We track birthdays, doctor's appointments, children's shoe sizes, parents' medications, household supplies, all while our partners remain blissfully unburdened by this invisible labor. Natalie, who has been quiet until now, speaks hesitantly. My husband Craig still asks me where we keep the extra paper towels after 15 years in the same house. A knowing laugh ripples through the group. The problem isn't really about paper towels, Diane continues. It's that this pattern creates a form of emotional bankruptcy in long-term relationships. Each unacknowledged contribution, each moment of taking for granted, is like a small withdrawal from an emotional bank account. By our age, many of us are overdrawn. But surely they don't do it intentionally, Lizzie offers. Men are just wired differently, aren't they? Intention doesn't matter when the impact remains the same, Grace says, with unexpected firmness. And let's be honest, when something matters to them, they develop systems, reminders, elaborate methods to ensure it's handled properly. Richard never forgets to rotate his tires or check his fantasy football lineup. Sharon nods, a flash of recognition in her eyes. Martin can tell you the stats of every player on his favorite baseball team going back 20 years, but claims he just isn't good at remembering our grandchildren's birthdays. This leads directly into the second pattern, Diane says, what psychologists call the identity theft, the gradual erasure of self that happens in many long-term relationships. Grace goes perfectly still, her expression suddenly vulnerable. The other women watch her with quiet concern, sensing they've touched on something profound. After Richard's promotion 15 years ago, Grace begins slowly. We were at a company dinner. The CEO's wife asked me what I did. And before I could answer, Richard jumped in with, Grace is my rock at home. As if that was my occupation, my identity. She takes a careful breath. I had just completed my master's degree in art history. I was curating a local exhibition. But in that moment, I was reduced to an extension of him. It's the 1,000. Little moments where we're seen as wife of, rather than as ourselves, Diane explains. Research shows that women in long-term relationships often experience what's called identity foreclosure, prematurely settling for a narrowly defined role that doesn't encompass their full humanity. I used to paint, Grace says quietly. Did any of you know that? I was quite good. Richard called it my little hobby. Eventually, I stopped. Sharon reaches over to briefly touch Grace's hand. Martin introduced me as his trophy wife at a charity gala last year. He meant it as a compliment. I have 2 advanced degrees and ran our family business for 15 years while he built his career. This identity erosion creates a profound crisis that often surfaces when children leave and careers conclude, Diane explains. Suddenly, we're face-to-face with partners who never truly knew us, who never had to know us because our primary function was to support their narrative. Craig still introduces me as my wife, the nurse, Natalie adds. I haven't practiced nursing in 8 years. I run a healthcare consulting firm now, but somehow that doesn't register with him. And it's not just how they introduce us to others, Grace continues, warming to the topic. It's how they speak to us, how they consider, or don't consider, our opinions and needs. Richard will make plans affecting both of us without consulting me, then act surprised if I have objections. Lizzie nods reluctantly. Tom does that too. Last month he invited his entire family for Thanksgiving without asking me first. When I pointed out that we'd already discussed spending it with my sister, he said, "Oh, I didn't think you were serious about that." As if our words are merely suggestions to be considered rather than expressions of our actual thoughts and desires, Diane observes. This brings us to the third pattern, the emotional nutrition deficit. Lizzie leans forward slightly, her expression revealing that this might be particularly relevant to her experience. For decades, many of us have been providing emotional sustenance without receiving it in return, Diane explains. We've been taught to prioritize harmony over honesty, to manage not just our own emotions, but our partners as well. We interpret their needs, anticipate their reactions, and provide comfort while receiving minimal emotional sustenance in return. I'm always gauging Tom's moods, Lizzie admits. If he comes home looking tired, I immediately start thinking about how to make his evening easier. But when I'm exhausted, he rarely even notices. Martin notices, Sharon says with a tight smile. He just assumes I'll push through it because that's what I've always done. The research on this is quite staggering, Diane continues. Studies show that men in heterosexual marriages typically rely on their wives as their primary, sometimes only source of emotional support. Meanwhile, women tend to maintain multiple emotional support relationships. When surveyed about who they would turn to in an emotional crisis, married men overwhelmingly name their wives, while married women list female friends, sisters, and daughters before their husbands. That's certainly true for me, Grace acknowledges. When my mother died, Richard patted my shoulder and said, "Let me know if you need anything." Then he went golfing the next day because, as he put it, life goes on. It was my friends who actually showed up with practical and emotional support. What's particularly insidious about this pattern is that it creates a form of emotional malnutrition, Diane explains. We're constantly giving from an increasingly depleted reservoir. And as we age, we simply have less tolerance for this imbalance. Our emotional bandwidth narrows. The constant output with minimal input becomes unsustainable. Natalie hesitates before speaking. Craig calls me oversensitive when I express needs, but he expects me to instinctively understand when he's had a bad day and needs special consideration. The term for that is emotional labor asymmetry. Diane nods. Women perform approximately 80% of the emotional labor in heterosexual relationships, the work of managing feelings, maintaining connections, smoothing interactions, and preserving everyone's dignity. But is it their fault? Lizzie asks, still reluctant to place blame. Men aren't raised to understand emotions the way women are. That explanation might suffice at 25 or 30, Grace says firmly. Not at 55 or 60. At some point we must acknowledge that continuing to choose ignorance is itself a choice. The conversation pauses as Grace rises to refill teacups. The sunlight has shifted, casting longer shadows across the elegant room. There's a sense that boundaries have been crossed, that they've ventured into territory previously considered off-limits in their friendship. Should we move to the dining room? Grace suggests. I've prepared dinner, and this conversation deserves more than tea and cookies. As they relocate to Grace's formal dining room, the women seem to physically transition into a deeper level of intimacy and honesty. Crystal glasses catch the light from the chandelier, and the careful table setting provides a structured counterpoint to the increasingly unstructured revelations being shared. Once they've settled with plates of Grace's carefully prepared meal, Natalie, emboldened by the candor of the others, cautiously introduces the fourth pattern. "I've been noticing something in my own marriage," she begins. "Craig used to seem so substantial to me, impressive, but lately I've started to see him differently. The revelation of mediocrity," Diane supplies with a knowing nod. "It's a common experience, the growing awareness that the man you once idealized is, in fact, stubbornly ordinary." Natalie looks simultaneously relieved and guilty to hear her feelings named so directly. "It sounds terrible when you put it like that. Yet it's a predictable outcome of certain relationship dynamics," Diane continues. "Many women continue to evolve throughout adulthood, developing new interests, pursuing education, adapting to changing circumstances, while their partners remain relatively static, refusing opportunities for growth or self-improvement. Tom still tells the same jokes he told when we met," Lizzie admits. "He has the same political opinions, despite everything that's happened in the world. He dismisses new ideas without considering them." "Martin hasn't read a book in 15 years, Sharon adds quietly. "Meanwhile, I'm in 3 book clubs and take online courses regularly. Sometimes I try to discuss something I've learned, and he looks at me as if I'm speaking a foreign language." Research in developmental psychology shows that women typically continue cognitive and emotional development throughout adulthood at higher rates than men, Diane explains. Add to this the fact that many women of our generation suppress their own development during child-rearing years, only to experience accelerated growth once family responsibilities lessened. "Richard hasn't had a new thought since 1995, Grace says with unexpected bluntness, bringing a surprised laugh from the others. "Yet, he considers himself the intellectual authority in our household. Craig mansplains my own profession to me," Natalie adds, the term feeling foreign but satisfying on her tongue. "Last week, he attempted to explain healthcare regulations to me at a dinner party. I literally wrote policy briefs on those regulations. This developmental gap creates a fundamental incompatibility that becomes impossible to ignore as we age," Diane continues. "In our 30s or 40s, we might have focused on complementary strengths or practical partnership advantages. But in our 50s, 60s and beyond, intellectual and emotional companionship becomes increasingly important. I've tried to engage Tom in new experiences," Lizzie sighs. "He resists anything unfamiliar. Meanwhile, since retiring from teaching, I've taken up watercolor painting, joined a hiking group, and become involved in community theater. Martin refuses to try new restaurants," Sharon adds. "Why risk a bad meal?" he says. "After 3 decades, I can recite from memory what he'll order at every establishment we frequent." "The research suggests this is quite common," Diane explains. "A longitudinal study of married couples found that women were 3 times more likely than men to initiate new leisure activities after age 50. Women were also significantly more likely to pursue educational opportunities and explore new social connections." "But is it fair to blame them for not changing?" Lizzie asks. "Some people are just consistent. There's a profound difference between consistency and stagnation," Grace responds, "between stability and rigidity. Richard prides himself on being reliable and steady, which apparently means refusing to reconsider any opinion he formed 4 decades ago. The problem isn't that they don't evolve in exactly the same ways we do," Diane clarifies. "It's the active resistance to any evolution at all, and often the undermining of our attempts to grow and change." The women fall quiet for a moment, each seemingly lost in private reflection. The clink of silverware against fine china punctuates the silence. "So what do we do?" Natalie finally asks, voicing the question that hangs unspoken over the table. "If we recognize these patterns in our marriages, what then?" Grace refills wine glasses before responding. "That may be the most difficult question of all," she says. Because it forces us to confront not just our feelings about our partners, but about ourselves. Which brings us to the fifth and perhaps most painful pattern, Diane says carefully, the complicity reckoning, our growing awareness of our own role in maintaining these dynamics. Grace's expression tightens almost imperceptibly. She carefully sets down her glass, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Well," she says with forced lightness, "now we're getting to the heart of it, aren't we? If you find these insights resonating with your own experience, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more candid conversations about navigating the psychological challenges of aging relationships." The hardest part of my separation wasn't facing Dennis's anger or hurt, Diane continues. It was confronting my own complicity in a relationship that diminished me. For decades, I smiled and nodded through conversations where my opinions were dismissed. I apologized for having needs. I made excuses for neglect that I would never have tolerated from anyone else. Grace's knuckles whiten around her wineglass stem. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately," she admits. "The way I taught my daughters to accommodate Richard's moods, to wait for a good time to ask him for things. What message did that send them about their own worth?" "That's the essence of the complicity reckoning," Diane explains. "It's the painful awakening to our own role in maintaining these dynamics, not because we're weak or foolish, but because we were responding to powerful social conditioning and practical constraints. I spent years defending Martin to my friends," Sharon admits, "making excuses for his behavior, explaining away his thoughtlessness. He works so hard, I'd say. He's under so much pressure." As if I wasn't also working and under pressure. Research shows that women engage in significantly more relationship protective cognitions than men do, Diane notes. We reframe negative behaviors in positive ways. We attribute selfishness to stress. We convince ourselves that emotional neglect is just a different love language. I've told myself that Tom just doesn't notice things for nearly 30 years, Lizzie says. Last week, he noticed a scratch on his car from 50 feet away, but he didn't notice that I'd been crying before he got home. Natalie laughs without humor. Craig can recall baseball statistics from games he attended in high school, but claims he just forgets conversations where I express important needs. The selective competence is so frustrating, Grace agrees. Richard can manage complex financial portfolios, but supposedly can't figure out how to run the dishwasher correctly. This pattern of strategic incompetence has been well documented in social psychology, Diane explains. It's a form of learned helplessness that's highly selective in its application, and our complicity comes in accepting these claims of incompetence rather than recognizing them as choices. But what were our alternatives? Sharon asks, a defensive edge in her voice. Divorce wasn't as socially or financially viable when we were younger. Many of us stepped back from careers to raise children. We made pragmatic choices based on the realities we faced. Absolutely, Diane agrees. The complicity reckoning isn't about blame. It's about clarity. Understanding the forces that shaped our choices doesn't mean we were wrong to make them at the time, but it does mean we can make different choices now with the wisdom and perspective we've gained. I keep thinking about my mother, Grace says softly, how she endured my father's emotional distance for 53 years. On her deathbed, she took my hand and said, "Don't wait as long as I did to claim your life." I didn't understand what she meant then. That intergenerational pattern is significant, Diane nods. Many of us watched our mothers silently accommodate dismissive or neglectful husbands. We inherited a model of wifely forbearance that we're now questioning. I remember my mother going out spending money to my father every payday, Sharon recalls. Even though she managed their budget and paid all the bills, she would present his allowance like a supplicant. I swore I'd never be like that. Yet for years I've justified major purchases to Martin as if I need his approval, despite contributing equally to our finances. The research on financial dynamics in marriage is particularly revealing, Diane says. Even in households where women earn equal or greater income, they often experience what economists call symbolic deprivation, the need to justify spending on themselves while their partner's expenses go unquestioned. Tom has never once explained why he needs new golf clubs, Lizzie notes, but I find myself rehearsing justifications for buying a new dress, even when it's with money I've earned. This financial asymmetry is part of a broader pattern of entitlement versus accommodation, Diane explains. Studies show that men in heterosexual marriages typically feel entitled to leisure time, personal space, and autonomy in decision-making, while women tend to feel they must earn or justify these same basic rights. Richard has a study that's exclusively his space, Grace observes. No one enters without knocking. Meanwhile, every room in our home is subject to his intrusion at any moment. There is nowhere that's just mine. Craig interrupts my reading without a second thought, Natalie adds. But if I interrupt his television watching, he acts as if I've violated some sacred boundary. Martin gets irritable if dinner isn't ready when he's hungry, Sharon says. But I've waited hours for him with no apology when he decides to stop for drinks after work. This entitlement gap widens with age, Diane continues. Research shows that men's sense of entitlement in marriage tends to increase over time, while women's decreases until midlife, at which point many experience a consciousness shift similar to what we're discussing tonight. It's as if we suddenly put on glasses that let us see clearly what's been in front of us all along, Grace muses. Exactly. And what's particularly painful about the complicity reckoning is recognizing how our own behavior has sometimes enabled this entitlement, Diane says. The times we've swallowed our anger, buried our needs, or performed affection we don't feel, all in service of maintaining a relationship that may no longer serve our well-being. I realized recently that I haven't been honest with Tom for years, Lizzie admits, her voice barely above a whisper. Not about affairs or anything dramatic, but about my feelings, my dissatisfactions, my disappointments. I've been editing myself to avoid conflict. That pattern of conflict avoidance has serious psychological consequences, Diane explains. Research shows that chronic emotional suppression is linked to depression, anxiety, and diminished immune function, especially in older adults. I developed migraines in my 40s, Sharon reveals. My doctor suggested they might be stress-related. Martin said I was overreacting to normal life pressures. The headaches mysteriously improved during the 2 weeks he was away visiting his brother. The body keeps the score, Diane nods. Our unacknowledged emotions don't simply disappear, they manifest physically in ways that become harder to ignore as we age. But acknowledging all this makes me feel like a failure, Lizzie says, voicing what perhaps several of them are feeling. As if admitting these problems means my entire marriage has been a mistake. That's a false dichotomy, Diane responds gently. Recognizing that certain aspects of your relationship have become harmful doesn't negate everything valuable about the life you've built together. It's possible to honor the past while still making difficult choices about the future. I think what I struggle with most, Grace says slowly, is the fear of being seen as just another cliché, the middle-aged woman who suddenly decides she's unhappy in her marriage, as if this realization is a symptom of menopause or empty nest syndrome, rather than a legitimate response to decades of subtle diminishment. That dismissal is itself a form of gaslighting, Diane points out. Women's midlife awakenings are often pathologized or trivialized, depicted in popular culture as irrational or selfish, rather than as reasonable responses to long-term inequities. Craig regularly jokes about women of a certain age being difficult, Natalie says with evident discomfort. When I object, he says, "I can't take a joke." That's another toxic pattern, Diane notes, using humor as a shield against accountability. The dismissal of legitimate concerns as just joking is a documented form of emotional manipulation. Martin does something similar, Sharon acknowledges. If I express frustration about his behavior, he'll say, "Here we go again," or "Someone's in a mood today." That dismissal of women's emotions as inherently irrational is deeply embedded in our culture, Diane explains. Psychological research shows that the same emotional expressions are interpreted differently based on gender. A man's anger is seen as responding to legitimate provocation, while a woman's is attributed to personality or hormones. Richard once suggested I see my doctor about medication when I confronted him about repeatedly interrupting me at a dinner party, Grace says, her voice tight with controlled anger, as if my objection to being disrespected was a chemical imbalance rather than a reasonable response. This brings us to another important aspect of the complicity reckoning, Diane continues. Recognizing how we've internalized these dismissive attitudes, how we've sometimes doubted our own perceptions and reactions rather than trusting our experience. I spent years asking myself if I was overreacting to Tom's behavior, Lizzie admits, wondering if I was being too sensitive or expecting too much. That self-doubt is the product of what psychologists call gaslighting, the systematic undermining of someone's perception of reality, Diane explains. Over time, this erodes our trust in our own judgment. I found myself apologizing to Richard last month for being upset that he forgot our anniversary, Grace says. I actually said, "I'm sorry for making such a big deal about this." Later, I realized how absurd that was, apologizing for having a reasonable expectation that my husband of 32 years would remember our wedding date. The impact of long-term gaslighting can be profound, Diane notes. Research shows it can create symptoms similar to PTSD, including hypervigilance, anxiety, and chronic self-doubt. I check and double-check myself before bringing up concerns. With Craig, Natalie acknowledges, I keep a journal sometimes just to confirm that what I remember happening actually did happen. That documentation is a common coping strategy. Diane nods. Many women find themselves creating evidence of their own reality because they've learned their word alone won't be sufficient. I have emails, Sharon admits with a small, sad smile. Promises Martin has made and broken, agreements we've reached, that he later denies. I've saved them all. This need to constantly validate our own experiences is exhausting, Grace says. It's a form of emotional labor that drains our energy and undermines our confidence, which circles back to the essential question, Diane says. At what point do we decide that the cost of maintaining these dynamics exceeds the benefits of the relationship? And what options do we realistically have at our age? A thoughtful silence falls over the table. The women seem to be weighing not just Diane's question, but the entirety of their own situations in light of the patterns they've been discussing. I don't think there's a universal answer, Grace finally says. For some, the best path might be separation or divorce. For others, it might be establishing new boundaries within the existing relationship. And for some, it might be finding ways to meet their needs outside the marriage while maintaining the partnership for practical reasons. The research supports that individualized approach, Diane agrees. Studies of women's midlife transitions suggest that there's no single right response to relationship dissatisfaction. The key factor in psychological well-being isn't whether women stay or leave, but whether they make conscious choices rather than remaining in unconscious patterns. I've been thinking about what conscious choice might look like for me, Lizzie says hesitantly. I'm not ready to leave Tom, but I'm also not willing to continue as things are. I've started being more direct about my needs and expectations, even when it creates conflict. That boundary setting is crucial, Diane nods. Whether you ultimately stay or go, establishing clear expectations and consequences is an essential first step in reclaiming your agency. I've been doing something similar with Martin, Sharon reveals. I've stopped managing his emotions and relationships for him. His sister called me last week, upset that he hadn't returned her calls. Instead of making excuses for him or promising to remind him, I simply said, "You'll need to discuss that with Martin." That detachment from responsibility for his actions is an important transition, Diane affirms. It's what psychologists call differentiation, the process of distinguishing your emotions and responsibilities from those of your partner. I've been working on financial independence, Natalie shares. I've opened accounts in my name only and begun putting aside money each month, not necessarily for divorce, but for options. That practical preparation is wise regardless of your ultimate decision, Diane says. Financial entanglement is one of the primary factors that keeps women in unsatisfying relationships, especially as we age and retirement concerns become more pressing. I've been reconnecting with parts of myself that got lost in my marriage, Grace says. I started painting again. I joined a book group separate from this one, focused on art history. I'm planning a trip to Italy next spring, with or without Richard. That reclamation of self is perhaps the most essential element, Diane observes. Research shows that women who develop autonomous interests and identities in midlife report greater life satisfaction regardless of their relationship status. It feels selfish sometimes, Lizzie admits, putting my needs and interests first after decades of prioritizing everyone else. That perception of selfishness is another internalized barrier, Diane points out. Studies show that women consistently rate the same self-care behaviors as more selfish when they engage in them than when others do. We've been conditioned to see our own needs as optional, while others' needs are non-negotiable. Martin actually used that word, selfish, when I said I wanted to visit my college roommate for a week, Sharon says. This is a man who has taken annual fishing trips with his friends for 30 years without a second thought. The double standard is remarkable when you start noticing it, Grace agrees. Richard expects uninterrupted time for his hobbies, but if I close the door to read a book, he'll knock to ask where we keep the extra toilet paper. This asymmetry in entitlement to time and space is well documented, Diane notes. Sociological studies show that men in heterosexual marriages typically have more uninterrupted leisure time, while women's time is more fragmented and subject to interruption. So what's your advice, Diane? Natalie asks. For those of us still trying to figure out our path forward, Diane considers the question carefully before responding. I think the most important first step is radical honesty with ourselves. Above all, not just about our partner's behavior, but about our feelings, needs, and choices. Once we stop denying our own experience, we can make decisions from a place of clarity rather than habit or fear. That honesty is terrifying, Lizzie admits. Once I acknowledge how I truly feel, I can't unknow it. Exactly, Diane nods. And that's why so many women avoid this reckoning until it becomes impossible to ignore. But the alternative, continuing to live in silent resentment or emotional detachment, exacts its own terrible cost on our well-being. I've been thinking about what honest communication with Richard might look like, Grace says. Not accusations or ultimatums, but simply truth. I feel invisible in our relationship. I need intellectual engagement you're not providing. I'm reconsidering what I want for this final chapter of my life. That kind of clear, non-blaming communication is ideal, Diane agrees. Research shows that using I statements focused on feelings and needs is more effective than criticism or contempt, even when addressing long-standing issues. But what if they don't respond? Sharon asks. What if they dismiss these concerns like they've dismissed so many others? Then that response becomes valuable information for your decision-making, Diane says simply. if expressing fundamental needs results in dismissal rather than concern, that tells you something important about the possibility of meaningful change. My therapist says that people show us who they are, Natalie offers. Our job is to believe them rather than clinging to who we wish they were. That's profound wisdom, Diane nods. Many of us have stayed in unsatisfying relationships because we're attached to the potential we once saw in our partners rather than accepting the reality of who they've chosen to be. I think that's been true for me, Lizzie acknowledges. I keep waiting for Tom to become the man I thought I married, attentive, curious, engaged. But perhaps that man never existed, except in my hopes. The concept of potential can be particularly seductive, Diane observes. Research shows that women are more likely than men to remain in relationships based on their partner's perceived potential rather than their consistent behavior. I stayed with Dennis for at least a decade longer than I should have because of occasional moments when he showed insight or empathy, Diane admits. I clung to those rare instances as evidence of who he really was, discounting the daily reality of emotional neglect. Martin can be wonderfully attentive during vacations or special occasions, Sharon says. I've used those times to justify enduring months of disconnect and dismissal. That intermittent reinforcement is actually the most powerful kind, Diane explains. Psychologically, we become more attached to rewards that are unpredictable than to those that are consistent. It's the same principle that makes gambling so addictive. So we're essentially gambling on our marriages, Grace says with a wry smile, enduring consistent disappointment for the occasional payoff of connection. When you put it that way, it doesn't sound like a very good bet, Natalie observes, bringing a ripple of knowing laughter from the group. If you're finding these insights valuable and they're resonating with your own experience, please take a moment to like this video. It helps others discover this crucial conversation that too often remains hidden in the shadows of long-term relationships. As the evening draws to a close, the women help Grace clear the table with the comfortable familiarity of long friendship. There's a lightness among them now, not because their challenges have been resolved, but because they've been acknowledged and shared. The burden of silent suffering has been lifted, if only for this evening. Thank you for hosting, Grace, Sharon says, as they gather again briefly in the sunroom. And thank you, Diane, for your candor. There's genuine warmth in her voice, despite the initial discomfort the conversation had caused. It feels good to speak the truth, Diane responds, and to know I'm not alone in these experiences. Lizzie reaches for her purse, then hesitates. I've been thinking about what you said, Diane, about making conscious choices. I'm going to talk to Tom tomorrow, really talk to him. Whether anything changes or not, at least I'll know I tried. Natalie nods. Craig and I are still early enough in our marriage that patterns might be changeable. I'm going to suggest couples therapy, and if he refuses, that tells me something important too. Sharon smooths her perfectly tailored slacks. I've decided to take that art history course in Paris I've been contemplating. 6 weeks away from Martin will either make my heart grow fonder or give me clarity about what I really want. They exchange hugs with the unspoken understanding that their friendship has entered a new phase, one where pretense and social nicety have given way to genuine sharing and support. One by one, they depart until only Grace remains in her elegant home. Grace moves through the quiet rooms, extinguishing lights, straightening cushions, the habitual motions of a woman who has maintained order and beauty in her surroundings while inner turmoil remained carefully contained. She pauses outside Richard's study, where light still spills from beneath the door. For a moment, she simply stands there, weighing decades of history against the clarity of her recent insights. Then, with steady resolve, she knocks. The patterns we've explored today are not inevitable sentences to lifelong dissatisfaction. They are recognizable dynamics that, once identified, can be addressed with courage and self-compassion. The revelation of these patterns in your own relationship need not be cause for despair, but can instead be the catalyst for authentic transformation, whether within your current partnership or beyond it. The path forward requires first and foremost a commitment to your own well-being and dignity. This isn't selfishness, it's self-preservation. You've spent decades accommodating, compromising, and adapting. Now may be the time to ask what you truly need and deserve in this chapter of your life. For some of you, this might mean having difficult but necessary conversations with your partner. Clear, non-accusatory communication about your feelings and needs can sometimes bridge divides that silence has widened over years. I feel invisible when I need more emotional engagement. I want us to grow together by... These statements center your experience without attacking your partner's character. For others, it might mean establishing firm boundaries within your existing relationship. Reclaiming space, time, and energy for yourself isn't punitive. It's essential for your continued vitality. You might find that releasing responsibility for your partner's emotions and choices brings unexpected liberation, even if the relationship itself remains. And for some, like Diane, it might mean making the difficult decision to leave a relationship that no longer supports your growth or honors your humanity. This choice isn't failure, it's courage. It acknowledges that sometimes love, history, and shared life aren't enough to overcome fundamental incompatibilities or harmful dynamics. Whatever a path you choose, remember that you are not alone in these experiences. Millions of women have walked similar journeys and found renewed purpose and joy in their later years. Whether within transformed relationships or in the creation of new, independent lives. The wisdom you've accumulated through decades of living is your greatest asset as you navigate these choices. Ask yourself, what small step might you take today toward greater authenticity in your relationship? How might you begin to express needs you've long suppressed? What boundaries could you establish to protect your emotional well-being? How might you reclaim parts of yourself that have been diminished or forgotten within your partnership? The ancient Stoics taught that while we cannot control external circumstances, we maintain absolute sovereignty over our own responses and choices. Your partner's behavior, the history of your relationship, the practical constraints you face, these are realities you may need to accept. But how you respond to these realities, what meaning you assign to them, and what actions you take moving forward, these remain entirely within your control. As Grace stands at Richard's door, she embodies this profound truth. Whatever happens next, she has reclaimed her agency. She has chosen authenticity over accommodation, clarity over denial. Whether her marriage ends or transforms, she has already achieved the most important victory, the reclamation of her authentic self. You too stand at a threshold of possibility. The patterns that have shaped your relationship need not determine its future. With compassion for yourself and clear-eyed wisdom about the dynamics you've experienced, you can write a new chapter that honors both your history and your deepest aspirations for the years ahead. If today's exploration has resonated with your own experience or given you insights about your relationship, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more wisdom on navigating life's most profound challenges with dignity and purpose.